patrons and subscribers, welcome back to the new show. My name's Random Rob. Today on the new show I wanted to do something a little different and respond to a question that my stepfather asked me about a year ago when I was having lunch at my parents' house that I didn't have a good answer for at the time. And the question was, what's the difference between sci-fi and horror? And it's not the simplest question to answer because there's a lot of overlap between the genres, depending on which works you're looking at and which era. And the most basic difference between science fiction and horror is that horror is always about monsters. Urban legends, ghosts, demons, possessions, altered humans, altered animals, giant animals, the undead, serial killers, death itself, nightmares, haunted places. One aspect almost all horror stories and films share is that the central monster is not always the villain. Usually there's a human character in there who is worse than the monster, or is enabling it somehow. Many science fiction stories and films feature monsters as well. This is probably the main point of overlap between the genres. One main difference in how monsters are used in science fiction versus horror is that in science fiction, monsters are usually not representations of evil, but are symbols of some kind of human failing. This can be seen in the 1960s Outer Limits and even in Star Trek. But monsters represent a small segment of the whole of science fiction, which encompasses space exploration, time travel, experimentation, computerization, future utopias, future dystopias, robots, alien technology, alien contact, alien invasions, clones, simulated reality, the end of the world. And you find that previous eras and decades of science fiction had a distinct popular flavor. From the early 1900s through the 1920s, eerie sci-fi and sci-fi horror were breakout genres. The books of H.P. Lovecraft and the lesser-known but influential novels of William Hope Hodgson and Robert Chambers. The 30s and 40s were the eras of the pulps and the space opera, adventure stories that took place in optimistic futures, like the works of A.E. Van Vogt or E.E. Doc Smith. In the 1950s, it was the nuclear era, and the era of the US-Soviet Cold War, and horror and sci-fi would overlap quite a bit, especially in the cinema, where monsters spawned by radiation were extremely popular, as well as alien invasion movies like Invasion of the Body Snatchers or Invaders from Mars that tapped into Cold War fears. In the late 60s, you had optimistic science fiction visions of the future, like Star Trek, and even 2001, but also films like Planet of the Apes, which, despite its more fantastic elements, had a heavy dose of social commentary in it. And social commentary would define much of science fiction through the 70s, as well as more films touching on future shock and techno-horror, like The Stepford Wives or Demon Seed. Dystopic visions of the future were pretty popular in the 1970s. By the 80s, though, people had apparently had enough of dystopias, and much of the popular science fiction cinema of that decade would be new takes on older genres, which was a trend that would continue through the 90s. Although we did finally see cinematic takes on the cyberpunk genre of the 80s, Ghost in the Shell, The Matrix, The 13th Floor, and even Dark City. Things were also happening in publishing and in television that were changing science fiction in the 80s and 90s. The good news was that science fiction television was getting smarter. You had breakout programs like Star Trek: The Next Generation and The X-Files that showed that the home audience liked serious sci-fi with heavy ideas. At the same time, though, what was happening in publishing was making the genre a lot dopier. You know, the 90s was the era of the big chain bookstores. Publishers wanted thicker books. They wanted more pages. The short, punchy science fiction novels of the past were being replaced by longer, more epic works. Everybody was trying to write a saga. And the big bookstores weren't really interested in providing literature and education. They were about selling what was popular. This was a time I remember going to bookstores and seeing on the science fiction shelves fewer and fewer books by classic authors and more movie and TV show tie-ins, a lot more derivative works. And in the age of digital publishing and Kindle, it only seems that this trend towards long-form serialized works has only increased. I feel in many ways that changes in cinema in the early 2000s also had a diluting effect on the science fiction genre, in that computer-generated effects improved a great deal, and that studios got into wars with each other over who could create the most incredible effects you'd never seen before. And I feel like these films often ended up being effects showcases with a story written in to prop up the effects instead of the other way around. So my point in going through these different eras and things that were happening within the genre is just to point out that what's popular in science fiction goes in cycles. And that despite the exceptions, that the genre has, for the most part, moved away from social commentary and gone back to the pulp era. The 80s were weird for sci-fi. There was a noticeable rift between print sci-fi and screen sci-fi that happened in the 80s that I blame mostly on Star Wars. Star Wars kicked off a ton of copycat films. It set a really high bar for special effects. Long story short, space opera became very popular again, and it was a lot harder to get a movie made of some of the serious science fiction that was being written in the 80s. Ideas that wouldn't end up on the screen for almost another 2 decades. At which point the prequels came out. Rinse, repeat. So the last thing I want to talk about here is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, arguably the novel that kicks off the science fiction genre. But it's also a horror story. And like I mentioned a while back, the creature in the novel Frankenstein is not specifically a personification of evil. Yes, the creature takes revenge on Victor Frankenstein by killing the people close to him, but the real villain of the novel is Frankenstein himself. His pride, his inability to take responsibility for the creature that he has made. When you read Frankenstein, you don't feel bad for Victor Frankenstein. He's a jerk. You feel compassion for the monster. And that is perhaps another key difference between the genres. That science fiction is a genre where you are allowed to have the reversal of protagonist and antagonist, where your expectations as a reader are upended. To me, science fiction is what I would call reverse mythology. Myths and legends were simple stories to answer complex questions about the world. Why do the seasons change? Where do we go when we die? Science fiction is a genre that shows us complex future answers to the questions of today, but does it in a way that raises more questions. And I can't help feeling at the moment that I've gone overlong and overcomplicated on what was a simple question. What's the difference between horror and sci-fi? Horror is always about monsters, and science fiction sometimes is. So what are your favorite periods or least favorite periods in either genre? Let me know in the comments below. And if you like what you heard, hit the like button and subscribe and consider becoming a patron of the new show. I could use your help. Okay, this is Random Rob signing off till next time. Be safe, be excellent, and take care. The new show is made possible by generous support from viewers like Tony, Arnell, Skipnick, Christopher, Marian, Eric, and B. Thank you so much for your support.